Not those ones. Mike pointed to another pair. Try them. The clerk froze for a moment, and then she forced a smile. Picking up the shoes in question, she presented them to Ava. What do you think of this pair? They don't look quite as flashy as the previous ones, but they're actually more expensive, and they're of excellent quality. I'm sure they're more suitable for a sophisticated woman like you. She was an experienced saleswoman, so she knew how to flatter her customers. Ava's own shoes were white, and although they matched her black dress, she'd always been a perfectionist about such things. She paid attention to detail, and she would never wear an expensive black dress with casual shoes. It would be humiliating if anyone saw her. The salespeople all had a gift for being able to determine a customer's shoe size by glancing at their feet, so the clerk had brought out a pair that fitted Ava perfectly. Ava changed into her new shoes and smiled with satisfaction. Checking the mirror, she turned to her left and then her right. Then she looked at Mike. Will these do, or will you be embarrassed to be seen with me? We'll take them, Mike told the clerk. Please wrap everything up. In less than 10 minutes, the clerk returned, beaming as she presented Mike with a 6-digit bill. You want everything wrapped up? Ava looked at Mike in confusion. She had thought she was buying an outfit to avoid embarrassing him by wearing her jeans everywhere. It's cold outside. Mike's tone was stubborn. You need something with long sleeves. The clerk was almost beside herself with joy at the thought of the commission she would make. Miss, our spring products are over here. She smiled at Ava as she led her to a display. Why don't you take a look? Everything here would look great on you. You're so lucky to have such a wonderful husband to buy you nice things. It's rare to see a man who loves his wife so much. Ava felt the sudden urge to take off her shoes and throw them at Mike's head. Meanwhile, Mike smiled to himself, not intending to correct the misunderstanding. I don't need any more clothes, Ava insisted. She didn't want to buy anything else, but the temperature was a little chilly. She looked around. Show me that shawl. 10 minutes later, Ava walked out of the store with the shawl covering her black dress. It looked good on her, and it kept her from feeling the cold. Mike's phone buzzed with a message from James. After reading it, he looked at Ava. I have to go, but why don't you carry on without me? The bodyguards will ensure everything is charged to my account. Ava didn't understand. You want to leave? I have something to do, he told her. Then I'll go back with you, Ava shrugged. It'll be better if I drive you back. One of the bodyguards can drive me. Mike was determined not to take her with him. Stay and have fun. It'll be perfectly safe here, but make sure you stick with the bodyguards until you leave. Mike knew the building would be covered by a professional security company, so no one would be able to cause trouble. It was one of the reasons he'd considered the place acceptable to visit. Ava shrugged, and then she sent Mike on his way. The message James had sent to Mike had read, "Landing in Providence now." Mike knew that meant Helen had arrived at the airport. Clearly, Helen had gone to a lot of trouble to get there, so she was determined to see Mike and reason with him. Mike's bodyguards drove him back to the house. Less than half an hour later, Helen arrived with James. Mike opened the door and saw her standing outside, looking quite calm. Hello, Mom. Helen frowned. She had intended to launch a surprise attack, but she realized Mike had been prepared for her visit. Glancing at James, she assumed he must have told Mike what he had planned. James looked around, not meeting her gaze. It was obvious he wanted to stay out of it. Are you claiming that your injuries aren't serious? Helen stared at her son. If that's true, then why are you still in a wheelchair? I'm following medical advice. Mike didn't elaborate. Helen could see that Mike wasn't wasting away, and he seemed to be in good spirits, so she was forced to accept his explanation. Where's Ava? Helen glanced around, but she couldn't see any sign of the young woman. Is she too afraid to face me? Mike wheeled himself out of her way. Come in and sit down. James used the excuse of pushing Mike's wheelchair to lean close and get further instructions. Keeping his voice down, Mike murmured, Go and check on Ava. He was still worried about leaving Ava alone for too long. Even though the security was good and she also had bodyguards, he'd feel better if James were there. After all, he couldn't be certain she wouldn't encounter people like Bree and Tiffany, who use their influence to pick on others. Helen strolled around the house, and she still couldn't see Ava. But she did notice the snacks on the coffee table, the yogurt in the fridge, the assortment of cushions, and fresh flowers on the table. She didn't believe for a second that any of that was Mike's doing. There was no way it was the house of a man living by himself. "You can stop looking," Mike's tone was dry. "Ava isn't here." He gestured for her to sit on the couch. Helen felt out of sorts. When she saw a bodyguard come in to pour her a cup of tea, she frowned. Where did James go? She wondered if he had gone to find Ava, but Mike didn't answer, so she couldn't be sure. Mike didn't want to waste any more time. "Mom, you flew all the way here, so just say what you want to say." Helen glared at her son. "You rented this place for Ava, didn't you?" Mike didn't bother to deny it. He didn't care much about his accommodation. If he had been alone, he would have chosen to stay in a hotel. And he wouldn't even have insisted on one of the best suites. The only consideration was whether the hotel had an appropriate level of security. But Ava was a whole other story. Even if she was in the fanciest house in the world, she could still find something to dislike about it. It would have been easier to buy a house for her, but they had been pressed for time, so he wouldn't have been able to find something that was up to her standards. "Ava's lucky she isn't here." Helen's tone dripped with ice. Summoning every ounce of authority she had as his mother, she decided to give him an order. "You're coming home with me today." Mike sighed. "You still don't get it, do you?" "What?" Helen snapped. "What don't I get?" "That I'm not a child." Mike met her gaze. "And you can't control me anymore." He showed no mercy, not even to his mother. Every scrap of tenderness he possessed was reserved for Ava. "You can't force me to go back with you, and I won't allow you to keep threatening me." Mike frowned at her. "If you make a fuss, I'll take Ava away somewhere and leave you here alone." He paused. "As for Ava, what do you think you can do to her? In the past, you could hurt her because she felt guilty towards you. But by now, she'll have realized she owes you nothing, so your opinion doesn't matter to her." Helen fought to keep her temper. As far as she was concerned, Ava still owed a debt to the King family. But she didn't want to argue about it, so she merely dismissed the idea. "You've obviously been bewitched by that woman. You're just confused." Mike couldn't be bothered to explain. "Then I'm quite happy to stay confused." "Don't you take that tone with me." Helen was so angry that she almost couldn't catch her breath. Taking a moment to compose herself, she glared at her son. "Fine then. You're clearly not going to listen to me, and it doesn't seem to matter how I feel about anything. After all, I'm just your mother. If you're so determined to be with Ava, then you go right ahead. But I will never give her my approval. No one will ever view her as being the proper Mrs. King." She knew that most people craved acceptance from their peers, so if Mike married Ava, he would be setting her up to be ridiculed by society. If Helen made it clear that she didn't like her daughter-in-law, others would follow suit, and Ava would become a laughingstock. She would be held up as an example for young people to avoid. Helen lost herself in daydreams of what people would say. "You don't want to be like Ava," one imaginary woman said. Even though she legally married Mike, she didn't get her mother-in-law's approval, so she's not really a proper wife. Another imaginary woman gave her son a warning. "Our family won't recognize the woman you like. If you marry her, she'll end up like Ava, and I'm sure you don't want that." Mike's voice broke into her fantasy. "Ava won't care about your approval, and neither do I. Regardless of whether you recognize her, she'll be my legal wife. And one day, she'll inherit everything I own. Why should she care what you think?" He knew his mother had never understood Ava. If she had, she would have known Ava wouldn't be afraid of her threats. "I am your mother!" Helen exclaimed. "Why don't you care about my feelings?" Her face turned bright red, and she suddenly looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown. She had no idea how to cope with Mike's determined attitude. "If you weren't my mother," Mike thought, "then I'd never have to let you set foot in this house." Choosing not to voice that thought, he tried his best to remain polite. Mom, as our family's heir, I've done everything I was supposed to. I've already gotten your revenge for you, and now it's time for me to focus on what I want. Helen scowled at him. And what foolishness do you think you want? Mike didn't even hesitate. I want Ava. It was as simple as that. In the past, he had wanted her as soon as he had seen her, and years later, he still wanted her. While Mike was arguing with his mother, Ava spent nearly 4 hours at a luxury spa. Once she was finished, she got dressed and left, surprised to see James waiting outside for her. Her eyes widened. What are you doing here? James sat on a chair outside the spa, trying to look inconspicuous. To a casual observer, he appeared to have dozed off. But as soon as Ava had left the spa, he had straightened up and opened his eyes. Miss Dawson, he stood up to greet her. The boss is worried, so he asked me to come and help you. Ava raised an eyebrow. Help me? It's more likely he wanted you to keep an eye on me. Well, yes, James flashed her a sympathetic smile. But I was trying to be diplomatic. Ava and James had grown quite familiar with each other, and they had a good relationship, so she didn't mind his presence. After the spa, she was craving something sweet, so she headed for the food court. So, what's keeping Mike so busy? She asked, glancing at James. And if it's so important, why aren't you helping him? Normally, Mike needed James to assist him with important business, so it was unusual for him to send the man to chase after Ava. It implied Mike wasn't dealing with anything related to business, so it had to be a private matter. Ava realized it was probably something he didn't want her to know. James cleared his throat. Well, you see, he trailed off, searching for the right words. It's okay, Ava took pity on him. You don't have to say anything. I was a little curious, but I'm not interested in Mike's personal life. I do have to remember to thank him for today, though. James was speechless, but he should have known she would react that way. When they arrived at the food court, Ava saw an advert for a caramel latte, and she promptly ordered one. James frowned, debating with himself about whether to report the matter back to Mike. In the end, he had decided to try his luck with her first. Mr. King says it's not a good idea to drink a lot of that stuff. It's just 1 cup, Ava rolled her eyes. It won't do me any harm. Besides, exactly how much constitutes too much? And it's not as though it's expensive. James squinted at the price list, and he was forced to agree that it wasn't exactly extravagant. Ava was in a good mood as she anticipated getting to drink her caramel latte, so she smiled at James and waited for him to accept her argument. Eventually, James sighed, giving in. Okay, I guess you know what you're doing. By the time Ava had finished her drink, she was in excellent spirits. When she spotted a hot dog cart on the way back, she insisted on stopping to buy one. James tried his best to dissuade her. Those carts are horribly unhygienic, and eating too much red meat is unhealthy. Ava merely looked at him, raising one eyebrow. James realized it'd be best to stop talking, but he couldn't help himself. Why are you looking at me like that? I'm trying to work out what your deal is, Ava shrugged. I mean, you've clearly been lying about your age and using some kind of miracle anti-aging product. She smirked at him. How else do you explain sounding like a little old grandma? James narrowed his eyes at her. Ava didn't have a big appetite, so she only ordered 1 hot dog for herself. Then she glanced at James and ordered one for him too. Although she enjoyed eating hot dogs, she didn't like being too close to the carts. She was worried about the smell clinging to her all day. James knew her well enough to know what the problem was. Realizing she was going to eat the hot dog no matter what he said, he told her to sit in the car while he waited for her order. When he returned with the hot dogs, she took one, holding out the other one to him. James stared at it, but he made no move to accept. Are you trying to bribe me into staying quiet? Ava snorted. Do you want it or not? Don't be such an old worrywart. If you keep frowning like that, you'll get wrinkles. James took the hot dog and began to eat, more to shut her up than because he was hungry. He actually enjoyed eating hot dogs, but he didn't like to do so in front of a young woman like Ava. Whenever she was around, he was careful to eat healthy, trying to encourage her to do the same. After all, he couldn't advise her to eat proper food and then eat junk right in front of her. Ava had thoroughly enjoyed her caramel latte and hot dog, and she was still feeling cheerful when she arrived back at the house. When she saw Mike sitting in the living room, she smiled at him and said, "Hi." "Have you had dinner?" Mike asked, signaling James to tell him he could leave. James nodded to Ava and then went outside. Ava wondered if she should find herself an assistant like James. Aiden hadn't employed such a person, but Ava could see how useful the man was. One day, when she no longer wanted to work, she could hand all the day-to-day business over to her assistant, and then she could relax. Although she had claimed not to be interested in the reason Mike had come back to the house earlier, she still looked around, hoping to find a trace of someone having been there. Of course, she couldn't see anything out of place. Mike watched as she shrugged off her shawl, revealing her black dress. He couldn't help but notice how well the dress highlighted her figure, and she looked stunning in it. "Did you have a caramel latte when you were out?" He kept his tone casual. Ava gave him a blank look. "No." Realizing she didn't sound very convincing, she continued to talk. "Do you mean that stuff I had with breakfast once?" "So you're saying you didn't have any this afternoon?" Mike took out his phone and held it up, showing her his bank account. Among all the large purchases, Ava spotted the one for her caramel latte. If she had known he would see it, she would have paid for the drink herself. The atmosphere grew a little awkward, but Mike merely watched her, as if waiting to see if she would keep lying. "I bought that for James," Ava shrugged. "He's never tried one before, so I thought he might like it. I was hoping it would perk him up a bit, maybe put a spring in his step." Mike nodded. "That makes sense," he lied. "I assume he also ate the hot dogs?" Ava gaped at him, trying to think of a suitable response. For a moment, she felt flustered, and then she realized she didn't have to explain herself to him. Mike spotted the change in her expression, and he knew she was done lying about it. "You have no say in what I eat or drink." She raised her chin, glaring at him. "I can do what I like, and you don't get to have an opinion." Mike tutted. "You don't understand yet, do you?" Although he knew she was correct that he had no right to care about her well-being, he was determined to change that. The wounds on Mike's back had healed well. When the dressing was removed, he was left with a large scab on his back. Ava went out and found the best ointments she could find for treating scars. When she returned, she held up a tube as she read out the instructions to Mike. "First, you need to use this white ointment until the wound is fully healed. Then you should switch to the blue one to improve the appearance of any scarring." The ointments came in standard-sized tubes, and Ava had brought several of them. Mike looked at them with a lack of enthusiasm. "Aren't you going to rub it on for me?" Ava frowned at him. "Why on earth would I do that?" Mike closed his eyes as if he were about to take a nap. It was obvious he had no intention of using the ointment himself. "I know you can hear me." Ava impatiently tapped her foot. "Well, suit yourself. I'm not the one with the scar." Mike remained unmoved. After all, he wasn't worried about having a scar, and it was on his back, so few people would see it. Besides, the scars would serve as a reminder of what happened, and he knew Ava would never be able to forget it. Ava put away the ointments. "Since you've recovered from your injuries, I'll be leaving tomorrow." Mike's eyes flew open, and he pinned her in place with his fierce gaze. "What?" she asked. "Your injuries have healed, so why shouldn't I leave?" Although Mike wanted to keep her there, he knew he couldn't stop her. If he did, she'd be furious at him, and he might never regain her trust. That night, Mike didn't speak to Ava at all. The next morning, Ava packed her bags and went downstairs. The first thing she saw was Mike, who was still sitting in the same position as the night before. More than 10 cigarette butts were in an ashtray in front of him. Even though the window was open, the smell of smoke was still strong. "Didn't you go to bed last night?" she asked. "Did you get any sleep at all?" Mike looked at her for a moment, and then his eyes moved to her bags. "I'll take you to Springfield." Ava realized she hadn't shared her plans with him. "But I'm not going to Springfield. I'm going to Boston to attend an award ceremony for a competition." Although the results had not yet been released, Ava had seen the other entries, and she was confident she would win. And even if she somehow failed to take first prize, she was certain she would at least come in second. After all, members of the public weren't blind or stupid. Her work was outstanding, and it was impossible that she wouldn't win a prize. Mike felt like she had dealt him another blow. Unable to respond for a moment, he merely stared at her. Ava calmly met his gaze, refusing to look away. When he still didn't say anything, she turned and left. When the bodyguard walked into the room, he was surprised to find Mike alone. "Mr. King, weren't you supposed to be going to Springfield with Miss Dawson?" "No," Mike scowled. The bodyguard could see that Mike was in a foul mood. Unlike James, who was Mike's friend, the bodyguard was wise enough to keep his questions to himself. Mike waved a hand. "Send an elite team of 6 men to protect her, but make sure they remain in the shadows." The bodyguard nodded his agreement. As a result, the 6-man team secretly followed Ava to Boston, choosing not to speculate on the sudden change of plans. Ava was looking forward to the award ceremony for the photography competition she had entered a while ago. Although the event was an international one, most of the contestants were American. When Ava arrived in Boston, she went to a familiar 5-star hotel and asked for a business suite. The hotel was expensive, probably costing more than the rent for the house Mike had rented, but Ava felt it was worth it. She'd already bought the equipment she required, and she didn't need to wait to receive profits from the studio. "I don't even need to buy a new dress," she thought. "I can wear that black one Mike bought for me." Although the dress probably wasn't elegant enough to receive an award, Ava didn't really care what anyone thought of her. After all, they were all members of the same industry. Besides, some of the less wealthy attendees would probably rent or borrow their expensive dresses, and no one would think any less of them. It was the quality of their work that counted, and some of the contestants seemed to Ava to be wasting their time. Her mind immediately flashed to Tiffany. The award ceremony was set to take place in a large auditorium. As soon as Ava stepped out of the car, she heard a familiar, annoying voice. "Miss Dawson, I hope you won't be too disappointed when you don't win. You do know that you don't have a chance, don't you? Is that why you're wearing that shabby dress?" Ava turned to see Tiffany walking toward her wearing a purple dress covered in tassels. Ava fought back a smile, thinking the other woman looked like a giant purple ostrich. Tiffany had been sure to speak loudly, wanting to make sure no one missed what she said. Ava's low-key arrival in a taxi hadn't garnered much attention, so Tiffany felt the need to point it out. Not everyone attending the awards ceremony had gotten dressed up. In fact, some people hadn't paid much attention to what they were wearing, while others had arrived in strange outfits. No one really cared, and if Tiffany hadn't pointed it out, no one would have a problem with Ava's dress. At most, they would have thought that her outfit wasn't as stunning as usual, but then they would have forgotten all about it. Ava frowned when she realized everyone was staring at her. She looked Tiffany up and down. "I didn't expect you to be wearing that designer's latest dress. Where on earth did you find the money for that?" Her lip curled as if looking at day-old produce that couldn't be sold. "Oh, did you only rent the dress?" Several bystanders giggled, and some of them began to discuss the matter. "Do you think she really did rent her dress?" "I don't know, but it seems odd. She looks too posh to do something like that." "Wait, isn't that Tiffany? I thought she was supposed to be rich, but she must be faking it if she has to rent clothes." Tiffany heard them gossiping about her, and she flushed with embarrassment. "Shut up," she snapped at Ava. "What the hell are you talking about? I own this dress. It's not a rental. After all, I'm not like you. I have a family to back me up, and I have plenty of money. Just because you couldn't afford to buy this dress doesn't mean I can't. So don't even joke about such a thing. It's not funny." They were standing outside, and Ava felt a little cold, so she didn't want to hang around to argue with an idiot like Tiffany. As she walked by the other women, she couldn't resist one last jab. "That dress is by Strawberry Wine. Did you know that the inspiration for her design came from one of my pictures? I won an award for it too. You should check it out." She gave Tiffany her best innocent expression. "It's funny though, only 10 dresses from that collection were released. Were you aware of that? I got one of them, and another 7 were sold to people I know. The remaining 2 were sold to companies that rent out clothes. She smiled, and then she turned to walk away. Tiffany's cheeks grew even warmer, and she couldn't bear the humiliation. Ava had been right about her renting the dress. The designer had grown so popular that Tiffany had been desperate to wear one of her creations. But she hadn't been able to afford to buy a dress, so she had decided to rent one. After all, she knew many people who only wore an outfit once, so she assumed no one would notice if she didn't wear the dress again. Of course, she would rather die than admit that truth to anyone. "That's a lie!" Her voice came out a little loud and high-pitched. "You're a nobody now, so what would you know about expensive dresses? You're just shooting your mouth off, and no one will be stupid enough to believe you." Ava had begun to climb the steps, so when she turned, she was looking down at Tiffany. Her expression made it clear that she thought Tiffany was an idiot. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Tiffany started to get a bad feeling that she was missing something. Everyone was looking at her with a mixture of surprise and amusement. Ava laughed, and then she turned and walked inside without answering. "Tiffany?" A nearby woman took pity on her and decided to explain. "Strawberry Wine is a friend of Ava's. How could you not know that? Everyone else does." Tiffany couldn't believe it. The new designer had been an overnight sensation, and it didn't seem possible that Ava could know her. After all, the Dawson family had collapsed years before Strawberry Wine had become famous. Tiffany pulled out her phone to check if it was true. When she read that Strawberry Wine's real name was Aubrey Baker, she began to feel sick. She had heard that Ava had a close friend called Aubrey, but she had never paid any attention to that. Similarly, she was aware that Strawberry Wine was a fabulous designer, but she had never bothered to find out anything about her. But as she belatedly put the pieces together, she realized she had made a fool of herself. If she hadn't been expecting to win an award later, she would have gone home and hidden herself away. People began to stream into the venue and take their seats. When Ava had given her a seat number, she frowned. Her seat was in the middle of the hall and not in the front row. Everyone knew how such things were organized. The award winners would be seated at the front, and the first few rows were always filled with industry big shots and other important people, such as the sponsors of the event. Ava's seat implied she was merely a member of the audience. She was confident in her professionalism, and she knew how talented she was. Even if her work hadn't been perfect, it was still of an exceptionally high standard, so it seemed unlikely that she hadn't won anything. Not wanting to make a fuss, she sat down and waited for the award ceremony to begin. She was interested to see who was good enough to have beaten her to first place. The awards would be announced in ascending order, so the first place winner would be announced last. First, the award-winning works would be displayed on the large screen, and the host would relay the comments from the judges. Then the photographer would go on stage to accept the award. Ava had carefully examined the other entries, and she knew they weren't as good as hers. She hoped nothing had gone wrong with the submission process. Then she wondered if someone behind the scenes had disqualified her for some reason. Finally, it was time to announce the winner. And now it's time to reveal the entry that's been awarded first place. The host gestured to the screen. It's a photograph of the sunset in the desert. You can see the continuous stretch of sand dunes, and a man is riding a camel while other camels follow him, laden with many goods. This photograph is called The Desert Man. Ava frowned when she saw the photograph. First place goes to Tiffany Conway for the stunning shot, the host beamed. Congratulations, Tiffany. Ava was so shocked that she didn't know how to respond. The photograph in question was hers. She had taken it herself, and then she had touched it up and submitted it via the official website. She had no idea why everyone thought it was Tiffany's work.